What's going on, guys? I'm Zach. Welcome back to Workshop Edits. In today's video, I want to take you through how I built this studio roller from scratch for my kitchen. Let's go ahead and get started. The great thing about building a studio roller is how many different ways you can get to the same solution, whether it's metalworking and welding, fine woodworking with some really cool unique joinery, or a CNC machine with really precise cuts. For me, I wanted to dip my toes into a welding project that had purpose for a kitchen, and it was nice to finally strike this one off the list. Now, for welding square tubing together, the trick to creating a uniform design that gives off the impression of a single piece of steel is to have pieces that all go together with matching angles. So if you're making a 90-degree joint, you need to have two pieces with 45-degree angles butted up against each other. If it's a 45-degree angle, you need 22.5-degree joints, and so on. The pieces need to have matching angles so that the corresponding welding surfaces line up. From there, I could take the two cut pieces over to my metal chop saw and set the fence to the exact measurements quickly, and so that I could make repeat cuts where needed. Now, as you saw from the design before, there were 5 total pieces of tube to cut for each side portion of this. To figure out the dimensions of my pieces, I worked up the design in Illustrator and did my best to measure, mark out, and cut each one. This isn't a precision welding project, and although I wanted it to look pretty, it really doesn't have to even be that strong. So that being said, it's better to aim for good welds with good penetration, but without burning through the thinner stock that I'd be using. So once I had all of my 45-degree angles cut, I could move to my smaller pieces at 22.5 degrees and measure and cut those to size. Now, I purposefully left the cuts of the final piece to the end so that I could lay out the design and then accurately cut each of the remaining 2 pieces simultaneously, and that way they were the exact same. Now, once each piece was cut, I could grind down the rough edges using my angle grinder and a flap disc. The goal here is just to remove the burrs from the metal saw cuts and to lightly chamfer the edges to allow for better welds. Once each piece was ready, it was time to weld things up. Using a series of magnets and my right angle marking gauge, I could line up piece by piece and tack weld in place, and then go back and add a single bead on 3 of the sides to secure the 2 pieces together. And I didn't weld the inside joint. Right now I just don't have the means to clean up ugly welds in tight spaces, so I focused on the other 3 sides that I knew I could get to. Now, even the most beginner welds can yield great results. Having done a few hours of practicing, developing proper hand movements, and understanding how long to hang on a piece of steel of different lengths and thicknesses, I can confidently say that I'm still not very good at it. But grinding things down with either a grinding disc or a flap disc can really clean things up, and even with just a 40 grit flap disc, you can nearly create something that looks as if it were a single piece that was always that shape. Now, this is a studio roller. The main function of it is to support a big roll of butcher block paper. In my case, it was 24 inches wide. I went back and forth on how I would hold the roll in place while also quickly allowing me to replace it if needed. Before getting to that, I need to weld the 2 end pieces together using 2 pieces of 16 gauge flat stock. 1 piece on the back that I could then attach to the wall eventually, and another piece on top to connect to a piece of lumber and to just help solidify the shape overall. So once again, I marked out and cut those to size on the chop saw and used magnets and other small measuring devices to weld the flat bar to the side pieces. Now, I'm still unsure of the trick to not burning the metal, but again, no worries, because a few minutes with the grinder can all but eliminate that and flush things up. For my design, one side will hardly ever be seen. That's just due to the layout of my kitchen. So I came up with a design that uses a piece of 5/8 inch all thread and a nut on one side, and then just a piece of small flat stock on the other side. And in doing this, what I could do is weld the nut to one side of the piece, the part that would be exposed to the kitchen, pass the all thread through the butcher paper roll, and then thread it into the nut, and then rest the other side on the angled flat stock. Super easy to screw into place and surprisingly secure, but also easy enough to unscrew if needed when the butcher paper needs replacing down the road. And if you want something prettier, you can always use a nut on each side, but it will take you a lot longer to thread that through both ends. So once that nut was welded on and the small piece of flat stock to rest the all thread was in place, and I confirmed my measurements, I could use a backup nut to lock in the length of the rod needed and cut it down again on the metal chop saw. Last up was designing a top. We had just installed a few floating shelves in our kitchen next to where this roller would go. It was a simple design that just used some 8/4 walnut. I used a large leftover piece from those shelves for the top. The first step was just to mark the final length of the piece by resting it on top of the welded roller. I then created a straight edge on one side over at the joiner and then planed down both sides to smooth things out and also take the overall thickness down by about 1/4 of an inch. From there, I used my table saw sled to square up both sides of the piece to its final length and then moved the fence in and ripped the top portion to its final width. Rather easy, and if you don't have a joiner or planer, you can just purchase pre-milled lumber for this step or skip the top portion of it altogether. It's mostly just a design choice in my case. Before finishing, I sanded down all the sharp edges. Aesthetically, I just thought it looked better, and to match the look of the shelves, I applied a single coat of wipe-on polyurethane to the piece. It rubs in and it cures in about 20 to 30 minutes. To attach the walnut to the shelf, I measured and punched 3 holes in the top flat stock and then went over to the drill press to drill these out. And a power drill works just fine for this step too. Now the original plan to hang this was to drill pilot holes through the flat stock that rested up against the wall and then attach to studs using lag screws. So my first step was to find those studs, mark the flat stock, and then drill out those back in the shop. However, this wall in particular backs up to my brick fireplace, which I realized was an issue after the fact, so instead of drilling large pilot holes that could only go in so deep, I instead drilled smaller ones and then hammered in wall anchors to the drywall to accept the smaller screws. And this was relatively simple. Having a small level on hand to check for square as well as a flexible drill bit made this really easy to secure, and it's only about 12 pounds, maybe 15 with the paper attached to it overall, so the anchors, although maybe not necessary, more than supported it against the wall, although I probably won't be doing any pull-ups from this. The last thing to do after it was mounted and the paper was installed using the all thread was to cut 2 matching pieces of flat stock and smooth down those edges. Then drill matching pilot holes on the ends of each piece. And these are so that the paper can be mounted flush against the wall on the top and bottom of the overall roller system. And much like the roller, I mounted these using wall anchors and screws. The anchors, again, I think were overkill, but I did it anyways. To raise them off the wall, I used 2 small washers in between the steel and the wall, leaving just enough space for the paper to pass underneath it. The key here is just to screw things in level, both horizontally and along the same vertical border as your studio ruler. And with a little teamwork to eyeball the perfect spot, I screwed in the bottom piece at a height we thought was best for the overall size of our roller and spacing on our wall, and called this project done. And you can see how the paper roll easily feeds from the roller through the 2 flat pieces of stock and could be torn off with ease at the bottom. Now I've seen quite a few of these in pictures in restaurants and bars, never really in kitchens. You can pretty much use them for anything though. Drawing, shopping lists, to-do lists, activities for the week with your family. They're a great DIY project that can add a lot of fun to your kitchen. And I know I went with the welding route, and that does have some barriers to entry through the investment in gear and in learning how to use that equipment, but I do want to reiterate that this can be made through quite a few DIY methods, so hopefully this is more of an inspiration than an exact design and method to follow. But if you do like how it turned out, then definitely give it a try, especially if you're trying to get into welding.